The great white shark is one of the most feared species of shark due to its imposing size, powerful appearance, and its huge, sharp teeth. Its carnivorous diet and attacks on humans have contributed to its reputation as a man-eater. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over some of the most gruesome great white shark attacks ever. Welcome to Final Affliction. Jurien Bay is a coastal town about 275 kilometers from Perth, located in Western Australia. It is considered to be a family favorite, with great swimming opportunities and beautiful crystal-clear beaches. It's a popular fishing spot, with many species readily available, such as herring and various shark species. Aside from those who enjoy the sport, there's plenty of fresh fish available for those who enjoy eating it without having to catch it first. Amazing restaurants offering hundreds of different styles of cooking. The area is also well known for its Australian sea lions, which are classified as endangered as the population continues to decrease over time. Since Jurien Bay is home to around 21% of the total population of this animal, many people come to visit for a chance to catch a glimpse of them before it's too late. With such a dense population of sea lions in one area, predators are always nearby. The locals know to be careful when entering these waters if they want to make it out alive. On August 19, 1967, Robert Bartle and his friend Lee Warner were preparing their dive at Jurien Bay. They were both in their 20s and were very experienced divers and spearfishers who enjoyed being in the ocean as much as possible. Early in the morning that day, the sea was particularly cool, with a slight swell that seemed even more inviting. The problem with this swell is that it dragged up a lot of sand and silt from the ocean floor, significantly reducing the visibility underwater. There were already other divers in the water by the time they arrived, and many people were practicing for a spearfishing competition that would take place in the next month. They quickly got ready, changing into black neoprene suits and grabbing their single rubber spear guns, ready to see what they could find under the waves. Unfortunately for them, they would find much more than they bargained for, and only one of them would leave the water that day. Using floats, they were towed out into the deeper waters until they were about 700 meters away from the shore. They could see that the sea floor was barren beneath them until they spotted some limestone ledges, which encouraged them to begin their dive. They knew that this environment was favored by large jewfish and were likely to make a decent catch if they went a little deeper. Lee initially remained on the surface to make sure everything was safe, while Robert dived down to investigate the area and see if any fish were hiding within the caves. Unfortunately, he couldn't find any signs of the fish, so decided that it would be best to move to another area instead. He began his ascent back to the surface with Lee, but as he was looking upwards, he spotted a large dark figure barreling towards him from the murky water. He stayed still, staring at the figure as it dove down closer and closer towards him from the surface. He was frozen in fear as he slowly realized the size of the creature swimming towards him. He was quickly face to face with a large great white shark, the most aggressive species of shark in the world. It was around 14 feet long and was using its powerful tail to effortlessly close the gap between itself and Robert. Robert had no time to react. As soon as he realized what was approaching him, it was already too late. The shark grabbed Robert between the hip and the shoulder, sinking its teeth deep into his body. The water immediately started turning red as his blood began to dye the ocean around him. He tried to struggle while punching the shark, but he was no match against an 1,800-pound animal. He felt the animal readjust its grip on his body tighter as it began to shake him with immense force, breaking his neck with whiplash in the process. As it shook him, his body began to break apart like a straw toy in the mouth of a dog. The only mercy that Robert was afforded was that he died relatively quickly. Unlike bears, who will start eating their prey before they have died, great white sharks will focus on killing their prey first to to avoid any further resistance. With one final shake, Robert's body was ripped into two, and the shark continued to circle the boat with his upper body still in its mouth, ready to be devoured later. Lee had been watching this attack in horror, seeing his friend brutally attacked and killed in front of him. It was immediately obvious that Robert was dead and there was nothing to be done. But now the shark had spotted him and had begun to circle him about 3 meters below. Seeing his friend Robert's upper body still in the shark's mouth, he knew that it wouldn't hesitate to kill him and that he now needed to fight for his own life. He looked around for something that he could use to save himself and spotted Robert's spear gun floating near him on the surface. He quickly grabbed it and fired it at the animal, hoping to strike it in the eye to scare it away from him. Despite being an experienced fisherman, the anxiety and terror of the situation proved to be too much, and he missed the shot, sending the spear rocketing past the shark's head. The animal was undeterred and continued circling him as it prepared to strike once again. By some miracle, the shark had unexpectedly gotten entangled in the ropes of the floats and the spear gun, triggering the shark to start thrashing in the water trying to free itself. This gave Lee enough time to begin his escape. He hurriedly started swimming back to shore, swimming backwards and keeping the shark in his sights as much as he could to prevent another sneak attack. After an agonizing length of time, Lee reached the surface and pulled himself to shore, finally free from the tirade of the infamous great white shark. Now that he was on shore, he needed to tell someone what had happened. Robert's family had to be told. He ran to Robert's car but was unable to find the keys. Frustrated, he found keys belonging to another diver who was still in the water and took them, deciding that the diver would understand the circumstances in which his car was taken. He drove to a nearby fishing village 10 kilometers away and quickly found someone who owned a boat and begged them for help. He told Harry Holmes the whole story and everything he had seen. He was horrified by the events. He was the skipper of the Gay Jan and immediately agreed to take Lee back out on the water to try to recover Robert's body, hoping that the shark was still entangled in the ropes as before. As the two men were racing out to the shark, they saw other divers in the water and periodically stopped to get them out of the water, explaining what had happened and how the water was not currently safe. The divers very gratefully got into their boat, thanking them for helping them avoid the same fate that had befallen Robert. By the time they reached the dive point, they had a lot of people in the boat keeping an eye out for the shark. Suddenly, someone spotted it, still trapped in the same ropes that Lee had left it. The scene looked like it could have come from a horror movie, blood and body parts littering the ocean surrounding the shark. They could see that Robert's torso was still in the shark's mouth, but the rest of his body was gone. It had either sank to the seafloor or the shark had already begun to eat his body. The group tried to pull the shark towards the boat to retrieve Robert's body parts, but as they were just within reach, the ropes encasing the shark snapped. The divers quickly pulled back, not knowing how the shark would now react, but luckily for them it swam away from the scene, taking what was left of Robert with it. It's believed that the shark thought that the men were sea lions, as their black hooded suits would have given them the same appearance as the shark's natural prey. When Robert began to struggle while being bitten, he would have mimicked the natural reaction of a captured seal, which only would have triggered the predator response of the shark. It's unlikely that the shark was aware that it was preying on a human instead of a seal, but as the apex predator of the ocean, everything is considered to be a prey animal to the great white shark. People have been advised to wear different colored suits or stay out of the bay when there are high numbers of sharks, but the area continues to attract thousands of visitors every year despite this. A few months after the attack, a monument was erected by Robert's family to commemorate his life and pay tribute to others who died in such a horrific manner. Around the same time, a radio station posted a $500 reward for the experienced fisherman who could take down the shark responsible for Robert's death. One man, Peter Godby, spent 24 hours throwing whale meat into the water in the hopes of glimpsing the shark, but without success. The reward was widely advertised across Western Australia, although no one was able to ever claim the prize and the shark was never found. With an average lifespan of great white shark at 40 to 70 years, it's possible that this shark is still lurking the waters off the coast of Australia to this day, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike again, sending someone else to meet their terrifying final affliction. North Narrabeen in Sydney may be known for its surfing now, but in 1935, it was part of a long list of beaches that were affected by shark attacks. No one knows why there was such an increase in attacks during that summer season, and yet many people, unfortunately, lost their lives as a result. There was one great white shark in particular that was causing havoc for surfers, and people were warned to avoid the water to limit their chances of meeting such a ferocious predator. Unfortunately, people were not keen to heed this advice, choosing to tempt fate and enjoy their favorite hobby regardless. Little did they know, a shark was waiting for someone to stray into the water so that it could rip them to pieces, and if anything got in its way, then it would chase them as close to land as possible. People tend to forget about the horrific injuries that sharks can inflict, but the animal will always be around to remind people to stay clear. 22-year-old Herbert McFarlane was a star in his hometown, earning fame and respect through his football skills. He was well known as an excellent athlete, as well as someone who loved to try new things. On March 5, 1935, he decided to try out surfing at the beach down the coast, about 45 minutes away, with his friend Colin Welsh. When they arrived at the beach, they were disappointed by the surf conditions, as the waves were very small, and with the tide coming in, they knew they would soon lose any hope of catching any decent waves. There were others already in the water, trying their hardest to make the most of the bad conditions before the sunset. At 5:30 p.m., the two friends got into the ocean and began to try and catch some of the waves, but they were breaking very far out to sea and settled before they reached any of the surfers. With the high tide, the water was much deeper, and a dark trench had been created in the sand below, perfect hideaway for a hungry shark. Colin refused to go past the trench, not wanting to risk what may be laying within the deep chasm, and tried to tell Herbert to stay in the shallows, where they could explore the rock pool. Colin knew what could be found in those deep waters, but Herbert didn't want to listen. The football player was determined to get some big waves and could see them further out to sea, so decided to swim out by himself. This decision would soon change the course of his life forever. He knew the water was getting deeper by how cold it had suddenly gotten. But even so, he had the waves in his sight, and he wouldn't be giving up now. The darkness was intimidating, but it would be worth it when he finally got to ride the big waves in the distance. Another surfer called William Bartle joined him for some time, where they assessed the waves about 30 yards further out. But even William thought it was too dangerous and refused to go. Against the advice of his new friend, Herbert decided to paddle out further into the dark sea towards the waves. He paddled towards the southern end of the beach in a last-ditch attempt to find a decent wave before he headed home. He continued for about 100 yards until he was alone in the water. No other surfers had bothered to swim this far, so Herbert thought he would be able to have exclusive access to all the big waves. Little did he know that he was now a sitting duck, the only prey in the water in the eyes of the predator lurking nearby. As Herbert stood on his board to ride one of the smaller waves, he was knocked from his board and dragged underwater. He was too shocked to realize what was happening, initially believing it to be a rock that he must have hit. He was quickly brought to his senses as a 4-meter great white shark sunk its teeth into his right leg. He screamed out in pain, his body on fire, as the shark continued to bite and tear at his body. It gradually moved up from his leg, seemingly trying to swallow him whole, but Herbert refused to die this way. He screamed out again, praying that someone would hear him and come to help him while he was dragged under the water again, fighting for his life. Herbert tried to pull his leg from the animal's mouth, but its grip was too strong, and he only succeeded in peeling more of his skin from his leg. He resurfaced, shouting for help. Luckily, his screams were heard by several surfers who began to make their way to him, hoping to help him before it was too late. William Bartle, whom he had left behind about 100 yards back, immediately began to swim in his direction, while members of the surf club on shore quickly mobilized to come to Herbert's aid, including John Barrett, Ken Harding, and Carl Reed, who were all 27 years old at the time. They raced to the shore and leapt into the water to try and get to Herbert. They didn't know him, and yet they still chose to swim through blood-soaked waters to save a stranger from a shark, knowing that they would likely be the next victims. John reached Herbert first. He was losing strength quickly, and by the time John reached him, he was floating on the surface, moving only with the waves as he was slowly being pushed back to the shoreline. John grabbed him by the shoulders and started to drag him back in, trying to talk to him as he struggled through the waves. All Herbert could say was, "I can't breathe," and "Get me out," as he felt himself weakening and knew he didn't have much time to spare. John continued to drag him through the water until he was met by the other swimmers who helped him the rest of the way. A blood trail showed their path through the water, and once they were on land, the surfers looked out to sea, only to spot the shark following them. It was following the smell of blood back to its prey, but finding that its meal had been pulled from the water, it hastily turned and swam back out to sea. If the rescuers had been a little slower, they surely would have been pulled down by the shark as it grabbed anyone that it could. It was a lucky escape for the rescuers, but now they had to keep Herbert alive. An ambulance was quickly called while the rescuers continued to try and help Herbert. While they waited, they could see that his right leg was completely mangled, with most of the skin being completely ripped off, muscle and bone showing through the blood that was covering his entire body. They tried to wrap Herbert's injuries in towels to slow the blood loss, thinking that they just needed to keep him alive until the paramedics arrived so that they could pass the care to the professionals. The ambulance arrived quickly and loaded Herbert into the back so that they could try to save him. His vitals were failing fast, and they were concerned that he wouldn't make it. The nearest hospital was very far away, and they had to weave in between the traffic if they even had a chance of getting there on time. Unfortunately, many of the cars couldn't move out of the way for the ambulance as the roads were very narrow around the coast, slowing the journey down, which cost them precious seconds. The hospital had been made aware of the accident and was setting up the operating table so that when Herbert arrived, he could immediately be transferred to the right department. Sadly, this never happened. Due to the slow traffic, Herbert McFarland died just minutes before he arrived at the hospital. Minutes that could have been saved if the cars could have gotten out of the way. Regardless, the result was the same, and Herbert became the fourth shark attack victim of the season. The community was devastated when they heard the news about Herbert, as many members had offered to donate their blood to save the young man. Lots of seasoned surfers gave up the sport as a result of what they saw on the beach that day, saying that the horrific injuries that Herbert sustained were enough to warn them of what is out there. Fishermen quickly began the hunt for the shark, knowing that if it had gotten a taste for human blood, it would only be a matter of time before it attacked again, but they were never able to find it. Shark sightings were reported sporadically over the next few weeks, but the shark that killed Herbert McFarland was never found, leaving surfers for years to come with the fear of the man-eating great white shark returning with its sight on them as its next meal, bringing them too to their terrifying final affliction. Byron Bay is a seaside paradise. Cafes, restaurants, and bars line the golden sandy beach. It draws visitors from far and wide, and it's a popular destination for backpackers with its beach-going lifestyle and relaxed atmosphere. A lighthouse lies at the far end of the bay, indicating mainland Australia's most easterly point. Everything in Byron centers around the beach and the swimming, snorkeling, and surfing on offer. But the waters around Australia are some of the most dangerous in the world. Sharks frequent the shallows and biodiverse reefs, drawn by the ocean currents and abundant fish. Although attacks do happen, they are considered rare. Byron Bay is a tourist hotspot and is visited by more than 2 million people each and every year. Many take to the water, enjoying the excellent surf and warm seas. Considering the number of people in the bay, attacks are few and far between. Before 2014, the last fatal attack at Byron Bay occurred in 1993. But in 2014, tragedy was about to strike the close-knit community once more. British expat Paul Wilcox grew up in Warwickshire in England, but had moved to Australia 10 years previously. He had married his wife, Victoria, and set up his own business in 2000. The lifestyle in Byron Bay suited him, and he fully immersed himself into the easygoing way of life. He joined the Byron Bay Swimming Club and went for a swim before work every morning. Despite being at the other end of the world from his parents, who now lived in North Wales in the UK, he still remained in close contact with them. They spoke on the phone every week. In fact, on Monday, September 8, 2014, Paul had what would be his last phone call with his parents. They joked about sharks in the area. Paul told his mother that he knew they were out there, but in the 10 years he had been swimming in the seas, he had never seen one. He reassured her that there had only been 3 attacks in the past 12 years. He was quite safe. They ended the call with Paul telling his mother that he needed a mum hug and her telling him to stay safe because he was so precious to her. That was the last time she heard her son's voice. The very next morning, on September 9th, Paul went for his morning swim as usual. He and his wife, Victoria, walked down to the beach. Both of them enjoyed keeping fit and would often swim together. This morning, however, Victoria decided to go for a jog along the beach instead, whilst Paul went for a dip. They said goodbye to each other and agreed to meet at the same spot a short time later. Victoria turned her back and ran off along the sand, whilst Paul stepped into the surf. The couple had been married for 24 years. They were living their best lives on Australia's east coast. Friends of theirs were arriving later that morning, and they had arranged to meet them for coffee after the morning swim. Sadly, that would never happen. The water was refreshing. There were other swimmers and surfers in the area. People walked along the beach, enjoying the morning sunshine. But what Paul didn't know was that there was a 7-foot great white shark swimming parallel to the shore. Always on the hunt for a meal, great whites are responsible for the most attacks on humans, along with tiger and bull sharks. Their size and ferocious bite makes them a deadly predator. As Paul swam a little way from the beach and then turned and began to swim along its length, the shark headed closer to shore. Above it, it could see the silhouetted outlines of surfers and swimmers on the surface of the water. Paul was in its line of sight, perfectly lined up for its rapid approach. It could be seen from above, a menacing dark shadow that glided effortlessly through the water, but nobody spotted it until it was too late. All of a sudden, Paul felt a sharp tug on his right leg. At first, it felt like something had run into him. Perhaps a surfer had come too close and knocked him with their surfboard. When Paul looked around, he saw the terrifying image of the great white shark with its powerful jaws clamped around his leg. He cried out and instinctively kicked away from it, but it wouldn't let go. He tried to kick its head with his other leg, aiming for its sensitive snout and eyes, but it held him fast. The shark's serrated teeth tore through skin and muscle and severed crucial blood vessels. Paul tried to keep his head above the water as the shark dragged him downwards. In the commotion, he managed to free his leg, but he was so badly wounded he was struggling to make it back to the shore. Blood poured from the open gash in his leg. The water around him turned a dark shade of red, a cloud engulfing him. He was losing blood fast, but the shark hadn't finished with him yet. It was coming back for more. It knew that its prey was mortally wounded and began circling Paul, biding its time, waiting for the opportune moment. On the beach, 52-year-old Mark Hickey, a Newcastle lawyer who was on holiday, was walking along the sand. He saw a commotion in the water. The dark red about 40 meters from shore looked like a tangle of seaweed waving with the motion of the sea. The object bobbing on the surface in its center looked like a sea turtle. Then he saw the terrifying triangular shape of a shark's dorsal fin circling the object. Mark raised his hand to his forehead and shielded his eyes against the glare of the sun. That's when his heart leapt. He realized that it wasn't a sea turtle. It was a person, barely afloat in the water, with a 7-foot great white shark circling him. He watched in horror as the shark swam back for Paul and tugged at his body again, pulling him underwater momentarily. When Paul's body bobbed back up to the surface, Mark jumped into action. Without hesitation or concern for his own safety, he leaped into the water. He rushed towards Paul and grabbed him by the arm. Paul was unresponsive. His eyes were closed. He had lost consciousness, and now Mark was in danger, surrounded by the pool of dark blood and holding onto the severely injured Paul. He was a prime target for the shark. Nervously, he looked around, half expecting to see the large head of the great white shark emerge beside him. Mark kicked furiously in the water, pulling Paul along with him. He screamed at beachgoers to call an ambulance as he powered through the chest-high surf. He made it to the beach moments later and dragged Paul up onto the sand. He immediately started CPR. A crowd gathered around the two of them. For 20 minutes, Mark continued CPR until emergency crews arrived. Unaware of the trouble Paul was in, Victoria had turned around at the end of the beach and began running back to her starting spot. That's when she saw a large crowd gathered on the sand. She could see a figure lying still, and her heart leapt when she realized that it could be Paul. She ran as fast as she could and pushed past the onlookers. Her worst fears were realized when she saw Paul lying on the beach and surrounded by blood-stained sand. Paramedics arrived moments later, but tragically, Paul was pronounced dead at the scene. Immediately, the beach was closed. Everybody was shocked by the death of Paul. He was well-liked amongst those in Byron Bay, and to lose one of their own was a huge tragedy. Lifeguards were called to help search for the shark at Byron Bay. It was easily spotted, still swimming in the water, its enormous body clearly visible just below the surface. Great white sharks are a protected species, and so it was not cold. Instead, lifeguards used jet skis and helicopters to drive the animal away from the shore. But now that it had a taste for human blood, would it be back for more? Victoria was in shock and was escorted to hospital, where it is reported that she was sedated. Her family rushed to her bedside to support her. Back in Wales, Paul's parents, Brian and Marie, learnt of the terrible news. Marie was in complete shock, having spoken to him less than 24 hours before. The only comfort Marie could take from the terrible loss was that Paul's death was incredibly quick, and that he died doing what he loved. She kept recalling the conversation she had with him only the day before, and the very last thing he said to her was, "I want a mum hug." Sadly, Paul Wilcox never would get that hug he wanted before meeting his terrifying final affliction. What do you like to do when you go to the beach? Do you like to relax on the golden sand? Maybe you like to read a book or go paddling in the sea. Well, for some people, diving is their passion, swimming amongst the different types of marine wildlife and exploring old wrecks that have sunk below the waves can be really exciting, but also really dangerous, as this one man found out in today's story. Manuel Lopez had lived on the coast of Mexico his entire life. He was proud of where he lived and his heritage that came with his place of birth. The 56-year-old man loved his home and wouldn't trade it for the world. However, his life wasn't necessarily an easy one. Taking advantage of where he lived, Manuel learned from an early age how to dive for the mollusks that lived on the bottom of the ocean floor. His father, who was a fisherman himself, taught Manuel just how important fishing was and how it could earn him a livelihood if it was done right. Manuel took all of his father's teachings to heart, and over the years, he practiced fishing and diving for mollusks until he was able to do both quite expertly. What he really loved was diving into the ocean in search of scallops, mussels, and all sorts of other shellfish. He found the thrill of diving down into the water exciting. He never knew what he might find or what kind of animals he might come across. Of course, as the years went by, Manuel also learned of the dangers that diving for shellfish could bring. Strong riptides could take him out to sea, where he could potentially end up getting lost. Murky waters could also bring danger, as Manuel could get lost in the silt and not know which direction to go in order to get back to safety. But the most dangerous thing of all were the predatory animals that lurked in the water: sharks. Mexico is home to a diverse range of shark species, with nearly 100 different types found in its waters. The Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea are particularly important areas for these animals, as they serve as breeding and feeding grounds for many species. There are some species of shark which live on the Mexican coast that are fairly calm and non-aggressive towards humans. These are the whale shark, the largest shark in the world, hence its name, and the nurse shark is also relatively harmless to humans, often dwelling on the bottom of the ocean in shallow waters to hunt for small fish. However, it is the more aggressive sharks that people need to worry about. Species such as the bull shark, which are actually responsible for most of the attacks in Mexico, the hammerhead sharks, and the one that many people find the scariest of all, the great white shark. Whilst common media has made them out to be more vindictive than they actually are, considering they are just animals acting on instinct, great whites are still a shark that nobody should mess with, as they are incredibly dangerous. However, sometimes circumstances push people to do things that might not necessarily be the wisest decision at the time. This is, unfortunately, what happened to Manuel. It was February 2023, coming into Mexico's springtime, and Manuel and his fellow fishermen were all busy, trying to collect as many mollusks and fish as possible so that they could sell them to local restaurants to earn a wage. However, there had been reports of quite a few sharks migrating into the waters around the coast so that they could hunt for fish and give birth to their young. Because of the number of sharks that were being reported in the area, including great whites, the fishermen, and especially the divers, were warned not to enter the ocean, as they could potentially be putting themselves at risk. For a little while, Manuel and his fellow fishermen stayed out of the ocean, as they didn't want to risk their lives. In times where people like Manuel can't work, the Mexican government gives out a stipend of 7,200 pesos, which is roughly $400 per year. However, this is not a lot to live off of, especially if the fishermen have a family to support. As the days passed by, there quickly became a shortage of seafood in the area, which meant that demand for the items were at an all-time high. Manuel found himself being drawn to the ocean to go diving for shellfish again, as he knew he could get a good price for his catch, and he needed the money to help support his family. Finally, deciding that he would rather take the risk to try and get a bit more money, Manuel put on his diving suit, a full gray suit, and went diving near San Jose Beach in Tabare Bay. He didn't have any diving equipment, preferring to hold his breath as he dived down to a depth of around 59 feet so that he could collect axe tripe, a mollusk which is like a scallop, from the ocean floor. It was a shellfish which Manuel had collected multiple times before, and he knew where to look to get the best fish. Despite the dangers, things were going well for Manuel for a little while. The diver was collecting the shellfish at quite a fast rate, and he was looking forward to the large amount of money he would hopefully be getting after he had sold all of his catch. Jose Bernal was another fisherman who was out with Manuel at the time. He was diving into the water from the boat that they had brought along and was collecting the mollusks as well. He had decided to get out of the water for a little while so that he could rest. However, Manuel felt that he was finding quite a lot of axe tripe, and he didn't want to lose the spot where he was finding all of the shellfish. It was whilst Manuel was diving to the ocean floor, though, that something happened that no one could have expected. As he was relaxing on the boat, Jose noticed an odd shape in the water. At first, the fisherman couldn't make out what the shape was, but as it got closer, Jose quickly felt panic taking a hold of him. He knew that the massive shape, which looked to be around 19 feet long, could only possibly be one thing: a shark. After coming to this conclusion, Jose's terror increased tenfold. He had no clue how he was supposed to alert Manuel to the danger, as he was still underwater, and Jose did not want to get back into the water with the dangerous shark nearby. The fisherman could only hope that Manuel wouldn't attract the shark's attention, and that it would simply swim on by. But that wasn't the case. Manuel, not having a clue what was happening or what was coming close to him, was quickly running out of air. Deciding that he needed to go back to the surface for air, Manuel began swimming up, taking his haul with him. However, in just one moment, everything changed for the worse. In one moment, Manuel was swimming happily, and then in the next moment, the massive great white shark came swimming out of the murky water, bursting through the water at 35 miles per hour, and in just one bite, the shark separated Manuel's head and part of his shoulders from his body. Jose had witnessed the entire event, and he could not believe what he had just seen. There was nothing that he could do for Manuel, as he was most certainly not alive anymore. With nothing else to do, Jose returned to the mainland, where he informed the proper authorities about what had happened. But why did the shark go after Manuel? Well, whilst great whites do attack up to 5 to 10 humans every year, they usually only take an experimental bite before moving on, as they are not actually that interested in hunting people. Instead, the great white's usual prey consists of seals, sea lions, dolphins, and turtles. However, every now and then they can get confused due to how people look in the water when they are swimming. Thinking that it was a source of food, the shark will attack the person, which could lead to some very serious injuries, or, in the worst case scenario, a fatality. This is sadly the most likely thing that happened to Manuel. The fisherman was most likely just unlucky to be in the water at the same time as the massive shark was swimming nearby. And whilst it wasn't necessarily anybody's fault what had happened to Manuel, it is important to remember that the ocean is the home of animals like sharks, and that it is always better to play it safe than to risk a life to dive into the ocean when these incredible creatures are nearby. Sadly, all that could be done for Manuel after the incident was to try and collect the body from the water, and then, once that was done, bury him in a proper grave. Fishermen spotted a shark off the coast of the western Mexico coastal town of Paredon, Colorado, 2 weeks after Manuel Lopez was attacked and killed by a shark while fishing for mollusks. This shark is thought to be the one responsible for decapitating Manuel. It has been spotted several times since the fatal attack, and authorities have been unable to kill it. This massive man-eating shark is still on the loose in the waters around Mexico, waiting to bring another innocent diver like Manuel Lopez to their terrifying final affliction. It was Friday, July 3, 1959, and 27-year-old Teresa Britton boarded the Colombian cargo ship Rio Atrato. She, along with 48 other passengers, were traveling on the freighter across the Caribbean Sea, but they would never reach their destination. Tragedy was about to strike the Colombian barge and all those who sailed in her. After it left the Colombian port of Cartagena, one of the major ports on Colombia's northern coast, the Rio Atrato headed westwards towards Panama. They hadn't gone far into their journey when disaster struck. At only 90 miles out to sea, there was a problem. Something ignited the 22,000 gallons of petrol on board, and the ship burst into flames. A series of explosions rocked the freighter. The loud bangs and shattered glass sent the passengers and crew diving for cover. A 19-month-old girl was one of the first casualties of the stricken vessel. She was killed instantly as fire engulfed the barge. People ran to the edge of the ship as it began to take on water. It would be a matter of hours before the Rio Atrato would be at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea. Captain Orestes Howard ordered the launching of the lifeboat, but it was chaotic on board the ship. A series of 10 explosions rang out, each one threatening to kill the passengers on board. The flames grew bigger. The burning of the fuel intensified. The heat was immense, the flames reaching high into the sky. Some passengers leapt into the sea, leaping for cover. Others, like Teresa Britton, managed to climb into the lifeboat. As the ship began to go down, People scrambled to hold onto anything they could to stay afloat in the wide open seas. Debris from the ship floated on the surface. The passengers clung to whatever they could find. They formed a life raft, enabling some to climb out of the water. Others pulled themselves onto wooden boxes. The flames from the ship soared upwards. They were spotted by another ship more than 10 miles away. Captain Theodore Bush was in charge of a German freighter named Essen. He was sailing the ship across the Caribbean Sea towards Panama when he saw the flames. The origin of the fire was below the horizon, but judging by the size and color of the bright yellow flames, he could tell that it was an open fire and likely a vessel on fire. He sped forwards to offer assistance, but his help would arrive too late for some. The passengers and crew had fought to escape the burning ship, but now they faced a new terror. Alfonso Payeras was desperately clinging onto a floating box. He and 5 other men held onto the same box and watched in disbelief as the cargo ship burned ferociously, sinking ever lower in the water. Salt water stung their eyes. Their arms burned as they gripped the box. They could feel the heat from the flames, the warmth on their faces. They needed to stay together. If help was to come, they needed to remain calm and stick together. But as the men held onto the debris, something lurked beneath them. Ever since the first explosion, sharks had been drawn to the commotion. They homed in on the wreckage, searching for an easy meal. They may have feasted on the bodies of those who had already died in the initial blast. The smell of blood, of fresh blood, enticed them closer. It was only a matter of time before they would attack. To his horror, Alfonso heard the man next to him cry out. He glanced around. There was a swirl in the water, and the man was gone. Alfonso shouted. The sea around him boiled red. He tried to climb up out of the water. Something was coming for them. Panic filled the survivors. There wasn't enough room on the lifeboat. Those who floated in the sea were in a precarious position as their legs dangled beneath them. They couldn't see underwater. They couldn't see the sharks circling below, but they knew they were there. They knew they were being hunted, and terror gripped them. As the hours passed, more and more sharks appeared. The survivors tried to fend them off, pushing at their snouts as they broke through the water, whacking them with whatever they had, an oar, some broken debris, or kicking them with their feet. But the sharks were becoming more frenzied. They had a taste for human flesh, and they wanted more. Teresa Britton sat on the side of the lifeboat, scanning the horizon. A shadow appeared below the water's surface, just off the bow. It torpedoed towards the lifeboat. In a split second, the shark had broken through the surface of the water and launched itself at Teresa, its huge mouth wide open. Its eyes rolled back, ready for impact. It clamped its jaws around the young woman, seizing her in its grip and pulling her into the water. It had happened so quickly. There was no time for Teresa to react, no time to fight off the shark. It had appeared from nowhere, snatching Teresa from outside the water. All Teresa managed to do was to let out a shriek before she was torn from her seat. The others in the lifeboat rushed to the edge, leaning over to try and grab her, but Teresa had disappeared underwater. She was likely dead within seconds. The shark's serrated teeth and its powerful bite would have been devastating. The impact likely knocked the air from Teresa's lungs before she was dragged downwards. The shipwreck survivors were traumatized by the events unfolding. They could do nothing but wait and fight off any sharks they spotted coming at them. But spotting them became more and more difficult as the light faded. And as hour after hour passed, their hopes of rescue faded. The survivors had witnessed 5 people die during the disaster. 2 of those had been pulled underwater by sharks. The others had died in the ship's explosions, including the 19-month-old toddler. Despite powering full steam ahead, it would be 8 hours before the Essen made it on site. Sharks pose a significant threat to the survivors of shipwrecks. They are drawn to the sound of the commotion as people enter the water, the screaming and shouting, the splashing at the water's surface. They can sense fear from those struggling in the water, trying to stay afloat or grab onto something. They are drawn to the blood from injured survivors. They can detect 1 drop of blood in 100 liters or 25 gallons of water and can detect it from up to 3 miles away. That means sharks from all over can make a beeline for shipwreck survivors. And as time goes on, fish gather beneath floating debris. These fish, as prey species, attract sharks to the area. After hypothermia and drowning, shark attacks are the most common reasons for deaths following a shipwrecking. When the Essen ship arrived, the crew could see the devastation that had occurred. The Rio Altrato was low in the water and would be at the bottom of the ocean in 2 more hours. Its fires were still raging. Fuel from its cargo spilled into the Caribbean Sea, a fuel slick that would disperse over many miles. Debris floated on the surface of the ocean. Men clung to floating boxes. A man-made life raft bobbed up and down. Passengers sprawled on its surface. The lifeboat was full to the brim with passengers, men, women, and children, huddled together for warmth and protection. The survivors had endured hell. Against all odds, they had survived a grueling 8 hours in the water, haunted by the loss of their fellow passengers to the jaws of prowling sharks. On arrival, the crew of the Essen immediately lowered their powered life raft. They set about retrieving the shipwrecked survivors from the sea, hauling them aboard. Visibly shaken and suffering from hypothermia, 13 of the survivors were in need of hospital treatment. 10 people were missing. 7 of them were passengers. The remaining were crew. They may have gone down with the ship, or they may have succumbed to the same fate as Teresa. They were never seen again. The Essen powered towards mainland Panama, and the Colombian survivors were treated for their ordeal. It had been a harrowing experience. It had been a tragedy for so many. 11 hours after the initial explosion, the Rio Altrato sank to the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, taking with it the lives of many. A terrifying way to meet your final affliction. It was the weekend. Sunday, September 8, 1991. Jonathan Lee was a 19-year-old second-year student at Adelaide University in South Australia. He was from the northeastern suburb of One Tree Hill. He and his mates enjoyed their weekends off from studying. It meant they could explore the surrounding area, have a break from lectures, and take a boat out into the sea to enjoy a spot of diving. This was the perfect way to spend their time off. They drove to Aldinga Beach, 45 kilometers south of Adelaide. From there, they hauled their dive gear into a boat and motored out from shore. The sky was clear. The air was warm. The group of friends laughed and chatted as the sea breeze blew their hair and the salt spray splashed into their faces. They were heading 350 meters offshore to a well-known dive spot simply called the Drop-Off. The golden sands at Aldinga Beach gave way to intertidal rock flats that extended offshore as a reef. Here, the depth dropped into an inky blue. Colorful fish swam amongst beautiful corals. Sea stars and sea urchins clung to the rocks. Groupers lurked below the overhangs and hid in the dark caves. Snappers swam past in their shoals, heading to their breeding grounds. Each snapper can grow up to 1.3 meters or 4 feet in length and weigh 20 kilograms or 44 pounds. They were easy prey for sharks. Where there were snappers, there were likely to be great white sharks in hot pursuit. When the group spotted the sea turn from a light blue to a deep, dark color, they knew they had reached the edge of the reef. They lowered the anchor, and each diver pulled their mask over their face, checked their regulator, and rolled off the side of the boat. Bubbles escaped from Jonathan's wetsuit as he submerged below the surface. The cool seawater engulfed him as he sank lower in the water column. The group of friends spread out as they each explored the reef. It was a beautiful underwater scene, the brightly colored fish flitting this way and that, a green sea turtle nibbling at sea lettuce growing from the side of the reef. Beyond the drop-off was the eerie blue expanse of the open ocean. But something nearby was on the hunt. A great white shark was drawn to the reef to prey on the fish. They were easy prey and abundant closer to shore. On this particular day, despite the perfect conditions above the water, the sea was murky. Silt and sediment had been churned up from the sea floor, making visibility relatively poor. 20 minutes into the dive, 4 of the friends headed back to the boat. They had seen enough. It had been a refreshing dip, and now they climbed out of the sea and sat on the boat, pulling off their dive gear. They patiently waited for the rest of the team to finish their dive. The remaining members of the group continued to view the amazing underwater wildlife. One of the more senior divers in the team was 30-year-old Dave Roberts. Not much later, he too decided to head for the boat. But as he began to swim back, he noticed something. It was a large, colorful rock that caught his eye. He swam down to take a closer look, and that's when he witnessed the shark attack. He didn't see it at first. Instead, what had caught his attention was a strange sound. It was like a booming of thunder, an ominous rumble. He looked upwards at the light penetrating the sea surface. Was it a boat powering through the water above them? The sound of its engine roaring and vibrating through the water column? That's what it sounded like. But when Dave looked up, he didn't see any sign of a boat. He looked below him, near the bottom of the reef. That's when he saw it. He saw an enormous great white shark. It was thrashing its head from side to side near the sea bottom, likely eating a grouper or a snapper. As its whole body arced and crashed, its tail whipped up sand from the seabed. A cloud of sand and silt surrounded the shark, obscuring Dave's view. He watched, fascinated by the attack. His heart thundered in his chest as he witnessed a top predator furiously on the hunt, just meters from where he swam. Then the cloud of silt and sand turned red as blood filled the surrounding water. This was no attack on a fish. This was something much larger. With his heart in his mouth, Dave suddenly realized this could be one of the team. He was filled with a sense of dread, a terrible feeling that he was witnessing one of his friends being mauled to death right before his eyes. But there was nothing he could do. He had no weapon. He had no way of distracting the shark or diverting its attention. He took a defensive position. There was no way he was going to swim back to the boat now. The most dangerous time of any dive is when the diver resurfaces. That's when they're at their most vulnerable. That's when most shark attacks happen. The shark was in full attack mode, and all Dave could do was hide. He crouched down behind the large, colorful rock he had swum down to inspect in the first place. Hardly daring to breathe, he peered over the top of the rock, clinging onto its side with his gloved hands. Then the shark turned towards Dave. He crouched down further. The bubbles escaped from his mouthpiece, a giveaway to his position. He held his breath. Then he saw a sight that shook him to his core. Inside the shark's mouth was Jonathan, his dive buddy. Jonathan's body was limp and lifeless as the shark swam powerfully past Dave. He could see its eyes, dark black. It didn't look at him. It already had its catch. It stared, unblinking ahead as it passed within 2 feet of Dave. If he had stretched out his arm, he would have been able to touch it. Dave needed to get to the surface. He needed to warn the others and check that everyone else was okay. When the shark was out of sight, he made a dash for the surface. He propelled himself upwards with his flippers. His legs ached as he kicked furiously, the lactic acid building up, the burning sensation growing until finally he burst through the water into the warm air above. He pulled out his regulator. "Shark! Shark!" he screamed at the dive boat. The 4 friends already on board leapt into action. 18-year-old Ben Peterson hauled up the anchor and immediately motored over to Dave. Leaning over the side of the boat, the friends pulled him on board. As they did so, they noticed something floating in the water. Then something else, and something else. It was a dive fin, an oxygen tank, and some torn wetsuit. The tank was undamaged, not a sign of a scratch or a dent, but the air hose had been severed right by the regulator. In stunned silence, the 5 of them stared in disbelief for a few heartbreaking seconds at the equipment bobbing through the sea. The 3 remaining members of the group had also witnessed the attack. Just like Dave, they had taken a defensive position during the attack. They had seen the shark on top of Jonathan. It was as though it had pinned him to the floor as it bit into him, shaking him violently from side to side. When it was over, they too made a mad dash for the boat. The group quickly pulled themselves into the boat, breathless, shocked, and stunned. It could have been any one of them. They were lucky to be alive. They grabbed a flare and fired it into the air to signal for help. There was no sign of Jonathan now. He had been taken into the depths. The group searched the sea from the safety of the boat. They hoped that by some miracle Jonathan would pop up to the surface, having survived the terrible attack. But it wasn't to be. Sadly, Jonathan was never seen again. When the group made it back to dry land, they called the authorities. An extensive search was conducted to try and find any trace of the young student. Apart from a few body tissues found floating in the sea near the site of the attack, nothing was ever found. The only thing left of Jonathan was the horrifying story of his final affliction.